Rain falls in silent sheets, the kind that soaks into bones before you even notice you're cold. A lone figure stands motionless beneath the storm, his silhouette cutting through the mist, a samurai, armor glinting like wet stone. For centuries, we've pictured warriors like him bound by Bushido, that unshakable code of honor we all think we know. But what if the truth has been lost in the downpour of history? What if everything you've heard about the samurai's sacred vows, loyalty, courage, death before disgrace, was just a fraction of the story? Beneath the surface lies a shadowed world of forbidden rituals, texts burned to ash, and philosophies deemed too dangerous to survive. This isn't the tale of noble swordsmen you've been told. This is something far more human, far more real. Imagine a code not carved in stone but written in whispers, passed between trusted hands in candlelit rooms. Imagine teachings so potent, so revolutionary, they had to be erased not by enemies but by the samurai themselves. Why would a warrior class so obsessed with legacy deliberately bury their own beliefs? The answer lies in the cracks between history's official records, in the fragments of scrolls saved from bonfires, in the half-remembered prayers of descendants who still guard the old ways. What we call Bushido today is a polished mirror, reflecting only what the shoguns and scholars wanted us to see. But turn that mirror to the light just right, and the fractures reveal a different truth. This is a journey into the unspoken heart of the samurai, where honor wasn't always about dying well. Sometimes it was about surviving, about knowing when to break the rules to protect what mattered most. You'll meet forgotten masters who taught deception as a virtue, who saw mercy as the ultimate strength, who knew that a sword's sharpest edge was the mind behind it. By the end, you won't just question what you thought you knew. You'll see the samurai not as legends, but as men who wrestled with the same impossible choices we all face. The storm is breaking. Are you ready to step into it? The idea of Bushido as some ancient, unbroken moral compass for samurai is perhaps the greatest illusion ever sold. What we think of today as the way of the warrior wasn't some sacred doctrine passed down through centuries. It was largely stitched together in the late 19th century, when Japan was racing to reinvent itself for the modern world. Enter Nitobe Inazo, a diplomat and Christian convert who wrote Bushido, the Soul of Japan, in English for Western audiences. His book painted samurai ethics with a chivalrous gloss, comparing them to European knights, noble, devoted, bound by honor. But here's the twist: Nitobe wasn't even a samurai. He was born after the class had been abolished. His version of Bushido was less historical record and more a PR campaign, a way to make Japan seem dignified and spiritual to colonial powers eyeing Asia with suspicion. Yet long before Nitobe's romanticized version, samurai lived by a far messier code. Medieval battle records show warriors who prized survival over spectacle, who took heads for promotions rather than poetry. The 12th century Hojo Monogatari recounts samurai setting fire to homes to smoke out enemies, while Edo period manuals taught them to exploit an opponent's hesitation, hardly the stuff of fair duels. Even seppuku, that iconic act of honor, was often less about voluntary sacrifice and more about avoiding torture or protecting one's family from retaliation. The truth: samurai weren't monolithic martyrs. They were politicians, mercenaries, even thugs when the situation demanded. What's most fascinating isn't that Bushido was mythologized, it's why. After the Meiji Restoration, Japan needed heroes, not hired blades. The new government scrubbed the samurai's bloody pragmatism from the record, recasting them as moral pillars to unite a nation in flux. But peel back the propaganda and you'll find scrolls like the Hagakure, where Yamamoto Tsunetomo admits a warrior's path is to die without accomplishing one's aim. Not for glory, not for oaths, because sometimes duty means embracing futility. That's the Bushido no one talks about, not a creed but 1,000 whispered contradictions as human as the men who lived them. Before the rigid hierarchies of the Edo period pinned samurai to their lords with unbreakable bonds, these warriors operated in a world where loyalty was as fluid as the blood in the gutters. The pre-17th century was an era of constant upheaval, where clan allegiances shifted like sand and a dagger in the dark could rewrite history faster than any battlefield victory. Take Eiichai Mitsuhide, the man who dared to burn his own master alive. When he turned on Oda Nobunaga in 1582, it wasn't some grand moral stand, it was survival. Nobunaga had a habit of humiliating his generals, and Mitsuhide knew his head would be next if he didn't strike first. This was the brutal calculus of the Sengoku period. Samurai didn't serve causes, they served opportunity. The so-called Warring States era rewarded pragmatists, not idealists. Men like Takedo Shinjin and Yusugi Kenshin forged legendary rivalries, but their famous battles were less about honor and more about securing rice fields to feed their armies. Even the iconic single combat between champions, often romanticized as noble duels, were tactical moves, sending out a skilled warrior to kill the enemy's best fighter before the main clash was about demoralization, not chivalry. The scrolls of the time tell a story modern Bushido would rather forget. Diaries like the Shincho Koki reveal Nobunaga's own rise was built on broken treaties and massacres, like the annihilation of the Enryaku-ji temple complex. His successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, went from peasant sandal-bearer to ruler of Japan by mastering the art of betrayal, first serving Nobunaga, then exploiting his death to seize power. These men weren't bound by codes, they wrote the rules in blood as they went. What's most revealing is how these samurai justified their actions. Medieval texts like the Gunki Monogatari didn't praise blind loyalty, they celebrated cleverness. A retainer who switched sides to save his family was seen as wise, not weak. The concept of ninjo, human emotion, often outweighed cold duty. When the Mori clan's vassal, Kakawa Motoharu, spared an enemy who'd shown him kindness years earlier, it wasn't seen as treason, it was remembered as humanity amidst the slaughter. This grey morality even extended to that most sacred samurai symbol, the sword. While later eras would mythologize the katana as a soulful extension of the warrior, early accounts treat swords as tools, sometimes brutally pragmatic ones. The Heike Monogatari describes samurai using daggers to finish off wounded enemies during battles, while archaeological evidence shows many carried cheap, mass-produced blades. The real sophistication wasn't in their steel, but in their political instincts. A surviving letter from the warlord Date Masamune advises his son, "Better to betray 10 allies than miss one chance to secure your domain." These weren't the stainless guardians of later legend. They were men who understood that sometimes to protect what you loved, you had to stain your hands. When the Tokugawa shogunate finally unified Japan and froze the social order, it needed samurai to be paragons, not pragmatists, so it buried their messy past beneath a new orthodoxy of obedience, but the cracks in that facade never fully healed. Zen monasteries weren't just places of quiet contemplation, they were training grounds for the deadliest minds of feudal Japan. While samurai swords got the glory, it was Zen Buddhism that forged the invisible blade, a warrior's psyche. Behind temple walls, monks drilled elite fighters in a radical concept called mushin, no mind, the art of emptying thought so completely that action flowed like water. No hesitation, no doubt, just the terrifying clarity of a blade moving before its wielder even consciously decided to strike. This wasn't philosophy. It was psychological warfare turned inward. The connection began in the Kamakura period, when samurai rulers started patronizing Zen temples. On the surface, it seemed like any other lordly donation for spiritual merit. But dig into scrolls like the Zazen Yojinki, and you'll find something far more pragmatic. these monks weren't just reciting sutras, they were running boot camps for mental resilience. One 13th century manual describes a chilling exercise. Warriors would sit in zazen meditation while a monk crept behind them with a wooden sword, striking without warning if their focus wavered. The lesson: in battle, a single lapse in awareness meant death. What made Zen so valuable to samurai was its brutal practicality. Unlike other Buddhist schools that emphasized compassion or rebirth, Zen's Rinzai sect used shocking methods to shatter the illusion of control. A famous anecdote tells of a young swordsman who boasted of his fearlessness until his Zen master quietly placed a silk scarf over his face during meditation. The moment it brushed his skin, the warrior panicked, revealing how deeply instinct still ruled him. True Mushin meant erasing even the fear of fear. Temple archives preserve stories that would make modern psychologists pause. The Ihei-ji monastery's records describe samurai undergoing sleepless retreats, pushed to the edge of hallucination to break their attachment to rational thought. Others practiced koan's paradoxes like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Not to find answers, but to short-circuit the mind's need for them. When facing an enemy's sword, hesitation was a liability. Yet the most subversive teaching wasn't about combat, it was about killing without hatred. Zen masters taught that anger clouded judgment. Real mastery meant striking with the detachment of a gardener pruning a branch. This unnerved even the samurai. The warlord Taikta Shinjin once demanded his Zen advisor explain how Buddhism's vow against killing aligned with battlefield slaughter. The monk's reply: when you cut down a foe, it is not you who kills, the universe moves through you. A loophole that turned massacre into meditation. The shoguns eventually saw the danger in such thinking. By the Edo period, state-sponsored Neo-Confucianism pushed Zen to the margins, recasting Bushido as loyalty to lords rather than mastery of self. But fragments survived. In the Hagakure, Yamamoto Tsunetomo admits the real warrior's secret. Meditation on inevitable death should be performed daily. Not for piety, so when the moment came, you'd already let go of life long before the blade fell. Buried in the private archives of a Tokyo university lies a crumbling scroll that shatters every noble myth about samurai honor. The 21 articles of Hojo Soun, penned around the year 1500, reads more like a mafia don's playbook than a chivalric code. This was no poetic meditation on Bushido, it was a survival manual written by a warlord who clawed his way up from peasant origins to rule the chaotic Kanto region. Article 4 delivers its lesson with chilling simplicity. When facing a stronger enemy, let them see only your smiles and agreements, then strike when their back is turned. What makes these directives so startling is their blunt honesty. While later Edo period texts would dress up warrior ethics in flowing proverbs, Hojo Soun's scroll drills into the dirty reality of power. Article 11 permits abandoning allies mid-battle if it means preserving your forces, while Article 17 advises planting false rumors to manipulate rival clans. Most striking is Article 9's cold calculus on hostages. Take the children of defeated lords, but treat them kindly. Their gratitude will make them useful spies. This wasn't treachery as last resort, it was strategy elevated to art. The survival of these documents is nothing short of miraculous. When Tokugawa censors scrubbed Japan's history to create their orderly Edo narrative, most pre-17th century texts advocating such pragmatism were burned. Only a handful of copies slipped through, hidden inside false bottomed chests or tucked between the pages of Buddhist scriptures. Even today, scholars debate whether certain passages were deliberately encoded, like Article 20's reference to the morning dew strategy, which some interpret as poisoning enemy water supplies under cover of night. Modern translations often soften the language, but the original manuscript leaves no room for misinterpretation. Where later samurai would speak of loyalty unto death, Hojo bluntly states in Article 15, a living dog is better than a dead lion. His rules acknowledge what later eras would deny, that samurai weren't born into nobility but carved their place through cunning as much as courage. The scroll even includes detailed instructions for faking combat injuries to gain sympathy, or staging fake retreats to lure enemies into ambushes. Perhaps most revealing is what the articles omit. There's no mention of dying gloriously for one's lord. Instead, Article 6 emphasizes keeping meticulous financial records to ensure troops get paid. No romanticized swordsmanship, just a reminder in Article 13 to always carry a spare dagger in your sleeve. This was Bushido stripped of all pretense, written by a man who understood that honor meant nothing if your clan starved before harvest. The few surviving accounts of Hojo Soun's reign prove he lived by his own ruthless creed. When the Imagawa clan demanded hostages to secure an alliance, he famously sent them a group of elderly farmers disguised in fine silks, buying time to fortify his borders. Later, facing impossible odds against the Usugi, he ordered his men to light victory bonfires behind enemy lines. The resulting panic scattered the opposition without a single sword drawn. These weren't the actions of some dishonorable rogue, but of a man playing the game as it existed in his time. The very existence of his scroll forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The samurai code we imagine was never static. It evolved with every bloody century, rewritten by survivors who knew the price of rigid ideals in a shifting world. Hojo's articles didn't disappear because they failed, they vanished because they worked too well, revealing truths that threatened the shogun's carefully constructed myth of warrior nobility. Tsukahara Bokuden's name should have been etched among the greatest swordsmen of history, yet his most dangerous ideas were nearly erased from memory. While other warriors of the 16th century composed flowery treatises on dying with honor, this master duelist penned a radical manuscript titled "The Sword Gives Life," arguing that true mastery wasn't in falling nobly, but in walking away from fights entirely. In one surviving passage, he writes, "The river that avoids the rock lasts longer than the one that shatters against it." For a culture already weaving myths around sacrificial deaths, this was heresy in ink. Bokuden's life reads like a rebuke to every Bushido cliché. Unlike Miyamoto Musashi, whose legend rests on 60 duels, Bokuden perfected the art of winning without drawing his blade. Contemporary accounts describe him disarming opponents with psychological tricks, showing up late to unsettle them, or deliberately stumbling to lure them into overconfidence. His scrolls reveal even bolder tactics, faking illness to avoid duels, paying off rivals' debts to dissolve conflicts, even disguising himself as a monk to travel safely through hostile territories. This wasn't cowardice, it was a calculated philosophy he called Katsujinkan, the life-giving sword. The few surviving fragments of his manual Hojo Soun read like nothing else from his era. Where samurai scribes typically glorified battle, Bokuden dissected it with cold pragmatism. A warrior's greatest weapon, he wrote, is knowing which battles will bleed his clan dry before the first arrow flies. He mapped out terrain advantages like a general, advising men to fight only when they held the high ground, and even then, to leave an escape route open. Most shocking were his instructions on retreat. If surrounded, throw gold coins to distract pursuers. Better to lose your purse than your head. What made Bokuden truly dangerous wasn't his sword arm, it was his understanding of human nature. He trained his students to exploit an enemy's pride, suggesting they praise an opponent's skill before battle so fiercely that the flattery would make them reckless. In one oft-suppressed anecdote, he reportedly won a duel by convincing his challenger that attacking an unarmed old man would stain his honor while secretly palming a dagger. The lesson: honor was a tool, not a chain. The Tokugawa shogunate's historians worked feverishly to bury Bokuden's legacy. His scrolls were banned from official archives, surviving only in secret transmissions among a handful of sword schools. When the samurai class was reinvented as moral paragons in the 19th century, his name was scrubbed from records, his philosophy rewritten to fit the new Bushido mythology. Even today, most martial arts manuals that cite him carefully omit his most controversial teachings, like his claim that 10 victories mean nothing if the 11th kills you. Yet traces persist in unlikely places. A merchant family's diary from 1702 describes an aging swordsman teaching their sons Bokuden's principles under cover of calligraphy lessons. A smuggled letter between two ronin in the 19th century references the old fox's way as they plotted to survive the collapsing samurai order. These fragments suggest his ideas never died, they just went underground, preserved by those who understood that sometimes the strongest blade is the one left sheathed. The tragic irony, Bokuden died peacefully in his bed at 83, surrounded by grandchildren, an ending most samurai could only dream of. His real crime wasn't dishonor. It was proving that the smartest warriors didn't bleed for glory. They outlasted the very system that demanded their sacrifice. History remembers the samurai as men, but the steel that shaped Japan was often wielded by women's hands. While later Bushido manuals would reduce noblewomen to symbols of chastity and sacrifice, the battlefield tells a different story. Take Nakano Takiko, the onna-bugeisha who led her own corps of female warriors during the Boshin War. As imperial troops closed in on Aizu in 1868, she didn't retreat to the castle like other women. She tied back her sleeves with white cloth, gripped her naginata, and charged into gunfire. But here's what most accounts miss. Her last act wasn't some blind suicidal rush. She turned to her sister warriors and said, "Don't let them take your heads as trophies." When mortally wounded, she ordered her own throat cut to deny the enemy proof of her death. This wasn't just bravery, it was a calculated defiance of how women's bodies were used as war prizes. Excavated diaries from the period reveal how women like Takiko redefined loyalty. Where men swore oaths to lords, these warriors often saw their primary duty as protecting communities. The recently discovered journals of Yamamoto Yiko, another Aizu defender, described turning down evacuation to stay with wounded civilians. "A samurai's wife doesn't abandon the weak," she wrote, a stark contrast to male contemporaries who measured honor in enemy heads taken. Even the language differed. Men's battle accounts obsess over face and posthumous reputation, while women's writings speak of threads, weaving imagery of interconnected fates. Some of the most startling evidence comes from Tomo Gozen's lost letters, fragments of which resurfaced in 2016. The legendary 12th century warrior, often reduced to a beautiful companion in male chronicles, wrote bluntly about the hypocrisy of Bushido. "When men speak of dying well, they mean dying where others can see." One passage reads, "We women have always known true courage is often unseen." Her descriptions of nursing wounded enemies back to health, then releasing them, would have scandalized her male counterparts. The shogunate's later censorship tried to erase these alternatives. Edo period edicts banned women from wearing swords, and official histories recast figures like Hangoku Gozen, who commanded 3,000 troops in 1201, as tragic maidens rather than strategists. But peasant revolts tell another story. During the Shimabara Rebellion, Christian women farmers fought alongside men using converted farm tools, their rallying cry. "A hoe to till the earth can till a skull just as well." Perhaps the most radical departure was in how women treated defeat. Male samurai culture fetishized seppuku, but female accounts show pragmatism. The memoirs of Hosokawa Gracia, a general's wife taken hostage in 1582, reveal she negotiated with captors to spare her retainers, then poisoned herself silently to deny them leverage. No dramatic belly cutting, just efficient calculus. Even in death, these women weaponized invisibility, subverting the very showmanship that defined male warrior culture. The tragedy isn't that women warriors were rare, it's that their stories were systematically dismantled. Archaeologists still find skeletons with battle injuries buried in secret Shinto rituals, their naginata blades deliberately broken to hide their wielders' identities. But the threads remain. In remote valleys of Tohoku, elderly women still sing work songs about the blade's moon, a poetic reference to women's circular fighting styles that prioritize defense over glory. These weren't exceptions to Bushido, they were its shadow curriculum, proving honor has always had more than one shape. A samurai's armor was never just metal, it was a whispered prayer forged into steel. The intricate engravings on kabuto helmets and do cuirasses weren't mere decoration, they were a secret language of survival. Artisans who hammered these plates worked in shadows, hiding Taoist hexagrams and Shinto kami symbols beneath layers of lacquer. The eight-pointed star of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, might grace a breastplate's interior, while the zigzag lightning patterns of Raijin, the thunder god, coiled around helmet rivets. These weren't just artistic flourishes, they were spiritual armor believed to deflect arrows and blades long before they ever struck. The paradox, these very symbols contradicted the later Edo period fantasy of Bushido as a purely secular code. Scrolls like the Gunpo Gyoshu, a 17th century military manual, explicitly instruct smiths to inscribe protective charms where enemies wouldn't see them, inside helmet bowls or under shoulder guards. One recovered cuirass from the Sengoku period bears a hidden Taoist Bogwa diagram, its trigrams arranged to invoke primordial chaos as a shield. Another features a barely visible onna-bugeisha, the legendary mountain ascetic, etched near the heart. These weren't the acts of warriors devoted solely to mortal loyalty. They revealed a deeper, older truth that samurai feared death as much as any man and sought every advantage against it. Even more revealing are the forbidden hybrids. A recently restored helmet in Kyoto's National Museum shows Yamaba, the cannibalistic mountain hag, merged with Fudo Myo-o, the wrathful Buddhist deity. This unholy fusion, a predator and protector in one, suggests warriors embraced ambiguity the later shogunate would purge. Armorers knew what historians later denied. Battle wasn't a clean duel of ideals, but a descent into primal terror where a fighter might need a demon's ruthlessness as much as a bodhisattva's mercy. The Tokugawa censors tried to erase this duality. As Bushido was sanitized into state propaganda, officials ordered the destruction of superstitious armor engravings. Smiths were pressured to replace esoteric motifs with cherry blossoms or pine needles, symbols of transient loyalty that suited the shogunate's agenda. But some resisted. X-rays of ostensibly pure Edo period helmets reveal older symbols deliberately concealed beneath new layers, like a 15th century kabuto with its original Taoist moon phases still gleaming under fresh gold leaf. These hidden layers tell us more about real samurai psychology than any official Bushido text. When a warrior strapped on armor, he wasn't just clothing himself in duty, he was wrapping himself in stolen fragments of every faith that promised survival. The greatest lie of the Edo period wasn't that samurai were fearless, it was that they ever fought alone. The courtyard reeked of iron and incense, a sickly blend that clung to the back of every warrior's throat. A line of heads sat propped on wooden stands, their eyelids stitched shut with red thread, not for dignity, but to prevent the dead from glaring accusations at their killers. This was Kyubai Jiken, the head inspection ceremony, where a samurai's reputation was measured in severed flesh. Far from the romanticized duels of later Bushido tales, this ritual was a bureaucratic horror show, complete with clerks verifying facial features against wanted lists and poets composing verses to sanitize slaughter into art. Surviving scrolls from the late Sengoku period reveal the grim choreography of these events. After battles, heads would be scrubbed of blood, their hair combed and teeth blackened to simulate aristocratic status because even in death class determined value. The Onnenkai Chronicle describes a general rejecting 3 heads because their ears weren't properly notched, the telltale sign of a peasant masquerading as nobility. Some warriors went further, stuffing mouths with perfumed cotton to mask the stench of decay during lengthy inspections. This wasn't savagery, it was theater, a way to transform butchery into a currency of promotion. What modern Bushido erases is how deeply transactional these rituals were. The Koyo-gunkan, a 16th century military manual, lays out precise point systems. A daimyo's head worth 50 gold pieces, a foot soldier's barely 5 copper coins. But the real prize was recognition. Paintings from the era show victors posing with heads on lacquered trays, their expressions carefully schooled into solemnity, yet private letters confess the truth. One retainer's diary admits, "My hands shook so violently I had to grip the tray with both arms, praying no one noticed." The shoguns didn't ban kyubai jiken because it was cruel, they outlawed it because it revealed too much. When Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan, he needed samurai to be bureaucrats, not bounty hunters. Edicts suddenly reframed head-taking as uncivilized, replacing it with paper commendations. But the practice didn't die, it mutated. During the Shimabara Rebellion in 1638, inspectors simply sketched heads on verification forms instead of displaying them. Even the infamous 47 Ronin snuck their enemy's head out in a bucket to avoid breaking the new rules while still honoring the old ways. Archaeology exposes the final hypocrisy. Excavated mass graves show heads removed with surgical precision long after the ceremonies were banned. A cache discovered near Osaka Castle in 2011 held 30 skulls with identical cleave marks behind the ears, forensic proof of post-mortem processing. The real Bushido lesson here: every era rewrites its morality to suit its needs, and honor has always been just another word for what the powerful decide to forgive. The Tokugawa shogunate didn't just rule Japan, it rewrote reality. By the early 1600s, the new regime faced a problem. Hundreds of regional warlords, each with their own brutal codes of conduct, now had to kneel to a single authority. The solution wasn't just military, it was archival. Teams of scholars were dispatched to castles across the islands with strict orders. Collect every battle manual, every clan chronicle, every private warrior's diary, and then burn anything that didn't fit the shogun's new mythology. Among the first texts to vanish was the Koyo-gunkan, a sprawling record of the Taikta clan's campaigns that described samurai as calculating mercenaries who switched allegiances for land and gold. In its place, the shogunate circulated sanitized copies where every act of betrayal became strategic redeployment, and every massacre was rebranded as divine punishment. This wasn't just propaganda, it was cultural surgery. The Tokugawa archivists developed a meticulous system for altering history. Regional dialects in battle reports were standardized into Edo-approved language. Dates were shifted to make rebellion seem shorter and less widespread. Even the physical format of documents changed. Older scrolls with bloodstains or tear marks were recopied onto pristine paper with elegant calligraphy, turning chaos into something resembling order. A surviving memo from the shogunate's censor office lists 12 forbidden themes, including disloyalty justified by circumstance and women bearing arms. One clerk's marginal note summarizes the policy: make their past as clean as their swords. The casualties of this campaign weren't just parchment and ink. Entire schools of martial philosophy were erased overnight. Take the Kage Ryu, a sword style from Kyushu that taught warriors to exploit an enemy's ethical codes, feigning surrender to lure opponents into range. Its manual, the Hojo Senshi Denki, was publicly burned in Nagasaki in 1623, its master forced to demonstrate only honorable techniques for shogunate inspectors. Similar fates befell the Nenryu's famed night-fighting tactics and the Chujo Ryu's manuals on psychological warfare. In their place, the state promoted tamer styles like the Yaju Shinkage Ryu, which emphasized dueling etiquette over battlefield pragmatism. But fragments of the truth slipped through. A merchant's ledger from Osaka details how one daimyo paid scribes to create two versions of his family's history, one for the shogun's inspectors, another hidden under floorboards. The banned original, rediscovered in 2008, contained shockingly modern concepts like temporary allegiance and retreat as strategic virtue. Even more revealing are the Kakashi Buko, secret weapons designed to circumvent Tokugawa decrees. Museums now display seemingly ordinary fans with concealed blades, or priest staffs engineered to fire arrows, proof that the old ways never died, they just went underground. The shogunate's greatest fear wasn't rebellion, it was memory. When researchers recently analyzed the paper fibers of official Edo period Bushido texts, they found layers of scraped-off ink beneath the surface. The original words, partially recovered through multispectral imaging, tell a different story, one where samurai negotiated ransoms instead of taking heads, where peasant uprisings were put down through bribes rather than bloodshed. This fabricated past wasn't clumsy. It was terrifyingly thorough, 1,000 tiny edits that transformed mercenaries into martyrs and pragmatism into heresy. Yet in remote mountain temples, aging warriors whispered the old truths to their students. A priest's diary from 1842 describes a midnight ritual where initiates burned the state-approved Bushido manual and inhaled its ashes to ingest the real way with our last breath. The shoguns may have controlled the records, but they couldn't erase the stubborn human habit of remembering. Dom Justo Takayama knelt on the foreign soil of Manila, his sword laid before him like a question. Exiled from Japan in 1614 for refusing to renounce Christianity, this daimyo who once commanded armies now slept on straw mats, his only remaining power the quiet defiance of his faith. In his final days, he reportedly whispered something that would have shocked his samurai peers. True loyalty is measured not in deaths offered to a lord, but in life given to the powerless. This wasn't just the pious talk of a convert, it was the creed of an entire underground network of Christian warriors who rewrote Bushido in secret. Recently unearthed Vatican archives reveal how these believers navigated impossible dualities. A Portuguese missionary's letter describes Takayama hosting clandestine masses where the Eucharist was concealed inside tsuba sword guards, the body of Christ resting where blood typically pooled. Another document details how Christian samurai developed coded battle standards, white banners with crimson crosses that could pass as clan insignia until the moment of attack. Most startling are the confessionals recorded by Jesuit priests, where warriors agonized over whether killing in war violated Christ's teachings. One Ronin's admission still echoes, "I clean my blade after battle not for sharpness but to wash away what clings to my soul." These men didn't see contradiction between the sword and the cross. They found synergy. Takayama's own writings reinterpreted Christ's passion through warrior logic. Judas' betrayal became the ultimate violation of guest right, while Peter cutting off Malchus' ear was framed as a failed attempt at controlled force. The Kurishiten Bushi Saizetsu, a banned catechism for Christian samurai, even repurposed Bushido's famous "die well" ethos. Be always prepared to perish, not for earthly honor, but as seed falls to earth for greater harvest. The shogunate didn't fear Christianity because it made samurai weak. It terrified them because it made warriors answerable to a higher authority than the state. When the Tokugawa banned the faith in 1614, they weren't just suppressing religion, they were erasing an entire school of moral reasoning that challenged their control. Persecution records show special cruelty reserved for Christian Bushi. The martyrdom of blessed Leo Nakanishi saw his executioners dull their blades intentionally, turning a ritual beheading into prolonged butchery, a warning about the cost of divided loyalties. Yet traces survived in folk memory. In hidden valleys of Kyushu, descendants of crypto-Christians still sing lullabies that morph into Latin hymns, their rhythms matching the cadence of sword drills. A Nagasaki silversmith recently discovered a crucifix ingeniously crafted to resemble a samurai's war fan when folded. And beneath Takayama's restored grave in Manila, archaeologists found shards of a shattered katana deliberately buried blade down a warrior's final act of surrender to the Prince of Peace. The tragedy isn't that Christian samurai failed, it's that their vision of Bushido, one where honor meant protecting the weak rather than serving power, was systematically erased. When Takayama died in exile, his last request was to be buried facing Japan, his homeland that had cast him out. 5 centuries later, that gaze still challenges us to ask, what does true loyalty demand when the codes of men collide with the conscience of the soul? The lanterns flickered in Edo's snowy streets the night the 47 Ronin struck, their blades slick with blood and politics. For centuries, their story has been held up as the ultimate act of Bushido loyal retainers avenging their disgraced lord no matter the cost. But a bundle of merchant ledgers discovered in 2017 tells a different tale. These yellowed pages, filled with mundane entries for rice and silk, reveal something explosive. Payments from the Ronin supporters to local theaters and scribes in the weeks before the attack. This wasn't just vengeance, it was a meticulously orchestrated revival of the samurai brand. The Akko incident unfolded in a Japan where warriors were becoming obsolete. By 1701, the Tokugawa shogunate had enjoyed a century of peace, leaving many samurai drowning in debt as bureaucratic paper pushers. The merchant accounts show a startling pattern: wealthy rice brokers and playwrights funneling money to the Ronin's cause, not out of charity but as an investment. One entry dated 2 months before the raid lists 50 gold pieces to a kabuki troupe for preparatory performances, likely staging scenes of heroic loyalty to prime public sentiment. Another notes payments to street criers to spread ballads about the Ronin's righteous suffering. Even the attack itself reeks of stagecraft. Contemporary police records describe how the Ronin deliberately left witnesses unharmed to spread word of their deed. They targeted Kira Yoshinaka's mansion at the 1 hour when Edo's night watch changed shifts, ensuring maximum drama with minimum resistance. Most damning. The merchant ledgers include receipts for fresh white kimono fabric delivered to the Ronin days prior, perfect for crafting those iconic Avengers robes that made them instantly recognizable in the snow. The shogunate's response was equally calculated. Though forced by law to order the Ronin seppuku, officials delayed the executions for months, allowing their legend to grow. Secret memos between magistrates recently uncovered show debates about using the incident to remind merchants of their place. When the 47 finally died, their graves became pilgrimage sites overnight, funded by the same business elites who'd bankrolled the spectacle. A surviving playbill from 1703 boasts of recreating the raid, with real swords loaned by the actors' noble patrons. Archaeology confirms the manipulation. Excavations at Kira's estate found no signs of the epic battle described in plays. Instead, forensic evidence points to a brief, one-sided skirmish consistent with accounts from Kira's surviving servants who testified the Ronin moved, like men performing a ritual, not fighting. Even the famous severed head presented at their lord's grave shows signs of post-mortem grooming, the hair neatly arranged for maximum symbolic impact. This wasn't the last gasp of Bushido, it was its reinvention. The same merchant ledgers show a surge in samurai-themed merchandise after the incident. Swordsmiths selling revenge daggers to commoners, printers hawking cheap Ronin woodblock prints. The shogunate, recognizing the propaganda value, quietly pardoned the Ronin's families and even pensioned some off. In death, these 47 failed retainers became the perfect PR tool, a sanitized symbol of loyalty that distracted from the reality of a warrior class grown soft on pawnshop loans and theater tickets. The real lesson of Akko isn't about honor, it's about narrative control. Just as Hollywood repackages history today, Edo's power brokers understood that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a blade, it's a story told so well people forget to question it. The snow that fell on the Ronins' graves didn't just cover their bodies, it buried the uncomfortable truth that even Bushido could be bought. Beneath the cherry blossoms of peaceful Edo, the soil held bones that told another story. While samurai poets composed verses about honor, their swords were busy elsewhere crushing peasant revolts with a brutality that official histories would later deny. The Shimabara Rebellion of 1638 wasn't just a revolt, it was a slaughterhouse where 37,000 farmers, women, and children were butchered under the banner of order. A recently unearthed scroll written by a survivor, hidden for centuries in a Kyushu temple attic, describes samurai tossing infants onto spears like melons at a festival. No Bushido, no mercy, just efficiency. These weren't battlefield excesses, they were policy. Shogunate edicts ordered entire villages razed for harboring rebels, with samurai paid bonuses per head collected. A merchant's ledger from Nagasaki lists payments for verification services, bureaucrats checking severed ears since heads took too much space to transport. The darkest revelation comes from a daimyo's private correspondence, where he casually compares peasant suppression to weeding a garden, adding that crying women make the best kindling for burning homes. Yet the farmers fought back with terrifying ingenuity. Archaeologists digging at Shimabara Castle found makeshift weapons, scythe blades reforged into spearheads, bamboo sticks studded with poisoned nails. One farmer's diary, smuggled out in a rice barrel, details how rebels used samurai arrogance against them. They expect us to flee or kneel, so we kneel then stab upward through their armor gaps. These weren't ignorant peasants, they were students of their oppressors, turning Bushido's predictability into a fatal weakness. The shogunate's cover-up began immediately. Surviving rebel leaders were crucified along major roads not just as punishment, but as living billboards to rewrite history. Official painters depicted them as monsters with fangs and horns, while scribes fabricated tales of samurai offering surrendering farmers fair trials. But the soil remembers. Mass graves uncovered in 2019 show bodies with hands still clutching farming tools, their skulls split by the precise downward cuts of execution-style killings. What makes these atrocities so chilling isn't their departure from Bushido, it's how they revealed its true function. Honor wasn't suspended against peasants, it never applied to them in the first place. The way of the warrior was always a class weapon, sharpened to divide those worthy of respect from those only fit for subjugation. When a dying rebel scrawled, "Our blood waters your honor," on a temple wall with his finger, he wasn't lamenting savagery, he was exposing the lie at samurai culture's core. The revolt's legacy lingers in unexpected ways. Rural shrines still display hidden straw dolls representing executed rebels passed down through generations. Fishermen near Shimabara refused to eat sea bream, the fish that swarmed to feed on corpses dumped offshore. And every spring, when tourists admire the castle's famous cherry blossoms, few notice how their roots twist around fragments of bone still pushing stubbornly toward the light. Deep in the mountains of Iga province, where mist clung to the trees like conspirators' whispers, men trained in darkness. These weren't the orderly fencing halls of Edo's approved academies. This was the Nen Ryu dojo, where students learned to fight in mud, rain, and total blackness. Their manuals, written in disappearing ink between the lines of innocent poetry books, contained instructions that would make a Tokugawa censor faint. How to coat arrowheads in rotting fish guts to induce infection, where to strike a man so his screams would panic his comrades, even the precise angle for cutting a ceiling rope to drop lanterns onto straw roofs. This wasn't just dishonorable warfare, it was mathematics applied to chaos. One surviving scroll from 1584 lays out the Five Thieves strategy, named after the constellations thieves used to navigate at night. Attack when Orion's belt aligns with the watchtower. It advises because guards will be drowsy after midnight rice. Another details how to mimic owl calls to signal different threats, 3 hoots for approaching patrols, 4 for unlocked gates. Most chilling is the laughing demon drill, where students practiced fighting while screaming hysterically to unnerve opponents. As the manual dryly notes, fear spreads faster than blade wounds. These schools didn't survive by accident. The Nen Ryu's floating world dojo in Osaka posed as a tea house, its basement reachable through a trapdoor hidden under a sumo wrestler's bathing tub. Training weapons were disguised as farming tools, sickle blades that detached into daggers, bamboo poles with weighted ends for silent knockout blows. Even their enrollment system was clandestine. Prospective students had to solve a series of riddles left at particular shrines just to find the dojo's location. What made these teachings truly dangerous wasn't their violence, but their philosophy. While official Bushido preached facing death with serene acceptance, Nen Ryu's texts advocated something far more radical. Victory is the only purity. A tattered manual recovered from a Kyoto antique shop contains marginalia where some long-dead master scribbled, "Better to be called a coward by 10 generations than fail your mission over pride." This wasn't just tactical flexibility, it was a complete rejection of the performance art samurai culture was becoming. The Tokugawa shogunate hunted these schools relentlessly. In 1612, a raid on a supposed Nen Ryu safe house yielded coded messages sewn into the lining of kimonos, detailing how to identify informants by their footwork patterns. But the knowledge refused to die. A merchant's diary from 1750 describes encountering a blind masseur who could disable a man with pressure points while casually discussing the weather. Even today, certain rural festivals feature masked dancers performing movements that match long-lost Nen Ryu stances, a memory kept alive in plain sight disguised as folklore. Perhaps the ultimate irony lies in how these dishonorable tactics shaped modern Japan. When Commodore Perry's black ships appeared in 1853, it was Nen Ryu descendants who advised the shogunate on asymmetrical defense strategies. Their last surviving manual, smuggled out during World War II, contains eerily accurate predictions about urban warfare and psychological operations. The page edges are frayed from generations of nervous fingers, proof that while Bushido became a museum piece, the real art of war never stopped evolving. The year 1876 should have been a time of celebration for Japan. The Meiji Emperor sat on a modern throne. Railroads crisscrossed once feudal lands, and Western envoys finally treated the nation as an equal. But in the shadows of Tokyo's new gaslit streets, former samurai clenched their fists around empty purses. These men had fought to overthrow the shogunate, believing a restored emperor would honor their service. Instead, they watched as the very government they helped create stripped away their stipends, banned their swords, and funneled their ancestral lands into the pockets of industrialists. The cruelest twist, the Meiji oligarchs justified every betrayal by wielding Bushido itself as a weapon. A speech by Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi in 1878 laid bare the manipulation. Standing before a restless crowd of ex-samurai in Kumamoto, he didn't offer restitution, he quoted the Hagakure. "The way of the warrior is death," he intoned, then pivoted without blinking. And what is death to a true patriot, if not the sacrifice of privilege for Japan's rising glory? The message was clear. Real samurai wouldn't complain about losing hereditary income. They'd celebrate their poverty as proof of loyalty. Never mind that the Hagakure's author, Yamamoto Tsunetomo, had written those words about battlefield courage, not economic dispossession. The Meiji spin doctors were rewriting scripture in real time. They weren't subtle about it. School textbooks from the 1880s reframed Bushido as spiritual wages to compensate for lost salaries. A particularly shameless government pamphlet circulated to unemployed Ronin declared, "To hunger for the nation is nobler than to feast for oneself." All while Meiji officials themselves dined on French cuisine in Tokyo's newly built Rokumaken ballroom. their pockets lined with samurai confiscated wealth. The hypocrisy wasn't accidental, it was systemic. When ex-samurai in Saga Prefecture revolted in 1874, the state crushed them with conscripted peasant soldiers, then praised the rebels' martial spirit in press releases even as their heads molded on pikes. The Meiji betrayal reached its zenith with the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors of 1882. This document, drafted by German advisors but dripping with faux Bushido rhetoric, ordered modern troops to consider loyalty your duty, specifically loyalty to the emperor and his ministers. Gone were Bushido's nuances about balancing duty with humanity. This was obedience reframed as sacred tradition, the rescript's most diabolical stroke. It applied Bushido's language of honor to common conscripts, effectively making every drafted farmer's son samurai in name while the real warriors starved. But some weren't fooled. Seigo Takamori, the legendary samurai who helped overthrow the shogunate only to see his class dismantled, left a cryptic poem before leading the Satsuma Rebellion. They call us relics while stealing our bones to build their new world. His rebellion's failure in 1877 became the Meiji government's favorite parable proof. They claimed that Bushido's highest form was dying quietly for progress. Yet in Kagashima's back alleys, aging samurai whispered a different lesson, that codes are always rewritten by the victors, and honor rarely survives those holding the pen. The ultimate insult came in 1899 when Nitobe Inazo, a man who'd never held a sword, published Bushido, the Soul of Japan, in English. His flowery portrayal of samurai as Japanese knights served Meiji propaganda perfectly, giving Westerners a romanticized lens to view Japan's rapid militarization. Meanwhile, the last true heirs of Bushido sold their heirlooms to pawnbrokers, their ancestors' armor repurposed as factory machine covers. The code that once guided warriors had become a noose tightened around the neck of history itself. Jules Brunet's sketches of samurai looked more like medieval knights than the men he actually encountered. The French artillery officer, sent to Japan in 1867 as a military advisor, filled his notebooks with drawings of noble-faced warriors striking heroic poses, never mind that the real samurai he trained were more likely to haggle over their pay than recite poetry. This wasn't observation, it was projection. Brunet and his fellow Europeans arrived in Japan at the perfect moment to invent the myth of the samurai, just as the class was being dismantled. They didn't see mercenaries or bureaucrats. They saw what they wanted to see, the last vestiges of their own imagined chivalric past. The romantic distortion started with simple mistranslations. When Portuguese missionaries first rendered Bushido as the way of the knight in the 16th century, they set a trap later Europeans would spring willingly. By the Victorian era, travelogues described samurai castles as Eastern Camelots, despite most being functional fortresses with sewage issues. A particularly egregious 1874 London newspaper article claimed samurai polished their swords with silk cloths, ignoring battlefield accounts of warriors wiping blades on dead enemies' robes. The exoticism served a purpose. It made Japan's rapid modernization seem less threatening to colonial powers if its warriors could be framed as tragic relics. Nowhere was this fantasy more blatant than in the opera, The Mikado. Gilbert and Sullivan's 1885 hit depicted samurai as delicate aesthetes, sighing over cherry blossoms while waving fans, a far cry from the tax-collecting enforcers who once roasted peasant rebels alive. The production's costume designs, based on second-hand kimono patterns, became so ingrained in Western minds that even today, Hollywood persists in dressing samurai in garish colors real warriors would have considered clownish. Authentic armor was muted for stealth and intimidation. The gaudy reds and golds Europeans loved were theater props mistaken for history. The most damaging misconception came wrapped in pseudo-philosophy. German philosopher Karl Lerwith, writing in 1936, declared Bushido proof of Japan's unique spiritual purity. conveniently ignoring how the Tokugawa shogunate had weaponized the concept for social control. This Orientalist lens turned samurai into one-dimensional symbols of either noble savagery for admirers or fanatical brutality for critics, with no room for the pragmatic merchants of violence who actually populated Japan's history. Even Lafcadio Hearn, usually a careful observer, fell into the trap when he described Bushido as stoicism with a floral garnish, missing entirely its blood-soaked accounting of tactical advantage. Archaeology exposes the gulf between myth and reality. When Western collectors purchased samurai swords in the late 19th century, they often received cheap Meiji-era replicas factory-made blades stamped with fake smiths' names to feed the craze. Museum conservators now find these fakes in collections worldwide, their pristine condition proving they were never used in battle. The same applies to armor. Countless heirloom sets sold to Europeans were actually assembled from mismatched pieces, their gilding applied specifically for export. The samurai these buyers imagined untouched by greed or modernization never existed outside their own longing for a simpler past. Perhaps the cruelest irony is how Japan itself eventually embraced the caricature. Desperate for foreign currency after World War II, the government repackaged Bushido as tourist-friendly wisdom, selling calligraphy scrolls with mistranslated Hagakure quotes to American GIs. Today, Kyoto's gift shops hawk plastic katana keychains next to T-shirts proclaiming, "Live by honor," a far cry from Hojo Soun's advice to strike when their back is turned. The samurai have become what every culture demands of its dead warriors, not the messy, contradictory humans they were, but mirrors for whatever we need them to reflect. By the time World War II reached its brutal climax, the words of an 18th century scribe named Yamamoto Tsunetomo had been twisted into something unrecognizable. His private musings in the Hagakure, a collection of thoughts on Bushido never meant for publication, were now being broadcast over military radios as justification for kamikaze attacks. "The way of the warrior is death." That infamous line echoed through training camps stripped of its original context. What Imperial Japan's propagandists conveniently omitted was Yamamoto's next sentence: "Not every death accomplishes meaning." The difference between these two phrases reveals how thoroughly Bushido had been weaponized. The truth, samurai surrendering in battle wasn't just common, it was often strategic brilliance. Medieval chronicles like the Heike Monogatari overflow with instances of defeated lords bargaining for their lives. When Tera no Shichiro was captured at the Battle of Ikai no Tani in 1184, he didn't disembowel himself in disgrace. He negotiated terms, later becoming a valuable political hostage. Even Oda Nobunaga, remembered for his ruthlessness, accepted the surrender of the Taikta clan's surviving generals after Nagashino in 1575, recognizing their skills were more useful alive than martyred. What changed? The Meiji government's desperation to compete with Western colonial powers. As Japan industrialized, its leaders mined Edo period texts for any passage that could justify absolute loyalty to the state. The Tokugawa-era emphasis on serving one's lord was surgically extracted from its original feudal context and repurposed as devotion to the emperor. A single line from the 17th century, Budo Shushinshu, about dying at the right moment, became twisted into a mandate for suicidal charges, ignoring the manual's 50 preceding pages on tactical retreats and honoring ceasefires. The distortion reached its peak with the Senjinkan Military Code of 1941. This booklet, issued to every Japanese soldier, quoted heavily from Bushido texts but with critical omissions. Where the Hagakure discussed death as one possibility among many, the Senjinkan presented it as the only honorable choice. Surrender wasn't just discouraged, it was framed as a metaphysical betrayal worse than defeat. The result: battlefield statistics from the Pacific Theater show Imperial Japanese forces surrendering at 1/20th the rate of German troops. not because they were inherently more fanatical, but because their cultural memory had been systematically rewritten. Archaeological evidence exposes the hypocrisy. Excavated letters from Saipan in 1944 reveal soldiers privately questioning the no-surrender doctrine with one writing. Even the 47 Ronin waited 2 years for their revenge. Why must we die in hours? Another scribbled a desperate haiku. Cicadas chant fall back / but the emperor's voice / only knows advance. These weren't cowards. They were men who'd actually read the classics they were ordered to die for. The greatest tragedy isn't how Bushido was misused in wartime, but how its original flexibility was erased. Samurai culture had always contained multitudes, the pragmatism of Hojo Soun coexisting with the idealism of Miyamoto Musashi. What Imperial Japan created was a monolith, a death cult masquerading as tradition. When American interrogators asked captured kamikaze pilots why they'd volunteered, many cited not ancient texts but a single modern phrase drilled into them: "Glorious death blossoms today for tomorrow's Japan." The cherry blossom metaphor was poignant but historically illiterate. Real samurai knew blossoms fell so the tree could live, not so it could burn itself to the roots. Beneath a farmer's field in Okayama, archaeologists unearthed what first looked like an ordinary stone circle until they brushed away centuries of dirt and found blades carved into its surface at precise angles. This wasn't a ritual site. It was a training grid from the 14th century, a lost dojo where samurai practiced killing strokes in the dark by feel alone. The grooves in the rock tell a story the history books never did. Combat training before Bushido became dogma, when survival mattered more than spectacle. The most revealing discovery was a massive compass rose etched into the floor, its 8 directions labeled not with pious virtues but brutal realities. Northeast read ambush, southeast retreat, and due west simply blood wind, a reminder to attack with the setting sun blinding opponents. This wasn't philosophy, it was physics. Modern martial artists who have replicated the layout report an eerie phenomenon. Standing at its center, echoes bounce off surrounding stones in a way that simulates battlefield chaos, forcing trainees to react to threats they can't see coming. Nearby, excavators found stone tablets covered in what appeared to be poetry until infrared scans revealed older texts beneath the surface. The original carvings were shockingly pragmatic. If surrounded, bite the throat. Kick dust into their eyes. One even depicted a diagram of pressure points to strike when disarmed, labeled with the sardonic note, "Courtesy when empty-handed." These weren't the teachings of noble warriors, but of men who knew honor meant nothing if you didn't live to enforce it. The dojo's architecture itself subverted later Bushido myths. Unlike Edo period halls with elevated platforms for spectators, this space had no viewing areas, only kill zones. The walls angled inward slightly, a design quirk that test show amplifies the sound of breathing, teaching fighters to track enemies by auditory cues. Even the floor sloped toward a central drain, suggesting they trained in mock battles so violent, the grooves still reeked of iron oxide when uncovered. Most telling are the artifacts left behind, broken practice swords with weighted tips for building arm strength, not the feather-light bamboo shinai of later eras. A cache of iron rings found in the corners matched descriptions in a band manual called the Ox Cart Scroll, which advised strapping them to fists to punch through armor gaps. But the real revelation came when researchers noticed the compass rose's markings aligned perfectly with seasonal sunrises. Summer solstice dawn would illuminate the fire quadrant, a chilling reminder that these warriors didn't just study technique. They weaponized time itself. What makes this site so revolutionary isn't its age, but its honesty. Here, buried under rice paddies for 600 years, lies proof that samurai combat began as a science of efficiency, not a performance of piety. The stones don't speak of dying well. They teach how to make sure someone else dies first. The discovery sent shockwaves through academic circles. A tattered scroll, allegedly from the late 16th century, surfaced at a Kyoto antique market in 2021. Its contents read like a criminal's playbook disguised as warrior wisdom. Article 3. When besieged, send gold to the enemy's second-in-command. Article 7. If ordered to commit seppuku, use a retractable blade to simulate death, then flee under cover of night. Dubbed the Ghost Scroll for its phantom-like reappearance, this single document threatened to unravel centuries of carefully curated samurai mythology. Carbon dating placed the paper in the correct era, but skeptics pounced on the ink analysis. The faded characters bore traces of a pigment common in the Edo period, yet the phrasing matched no known literary style. More damning, the scroll's provenance traced back to a notorious 20th century forger who specialized in samurai confessionals. But linguistic archaeologists uncovered something haunting. Embedded in the paper's fibers were flecks of a unique clay found only near a ruined castle where Hojo Soun's renegades made their last stand. The controversy split scholars into warring camps. Traditionalists dismissed it as a hoax, pointing to anachronistic terms like strategic withdrawal, which didn't appear in other texts until the 18th century. Revisionists countered with a bombshell, a previously ignored passage in the warlord date Masamune's private diary referencing the scroll of inverted virtues. Even the phrasing aligned. Masamune described a retainer who staged his own seppuku to infiltrate an enemy clan, mirroring the Ghost Scroll's Article 7. Most explosive were the scroll's political implications. One section detailed how to bribe Buddhist monks to falsely predict divine disapproval of a rival's campaign, a tactic eerily similar to Toyotomi Hideyoshi's sudden abandonment of a siege in 1585 after mysteriously receiving an oracle. Another passage advised faking possession by angry spirits to avoid dishonorable orders. If authentic, the scroll didn't just describe deception, it revealed how thoroughly theater shaped samurai governance. The debate took a surreal turn when a team of forensic linguists applied AI analysis. The software flagged recurring syntactic patterns matching a clandestine school of swordsmen called the Kurakawa Ryu, a lineage known for its ruthless pragmatism. Their lost manual, mentioned in a 17th century magistrate's report as filthy wisdom, had never been found. Suddenly, the Ghost Scroll's vulgar practicality, like its advice to sob uncontrollably when begging for mercy as tears loosen an enemy's grip, seemed less like forgery and more like a missing piece of history. Then came the silence. In 2023, the scroll's owner abruptly withdrew it from academic study, citing private reasons. Rumors swirled that nationalist groups had pressured its disappearance, unwilling to tolerate a narrative where samurai survival instincts outweighed blind loyalty. All that remains now are photographs and a single chilling line that lingers like a ghost's whisper. A warrior's first duty is to live long enough to rewrite his own legend. The polished wooden floor of a modern kendo dojo echoes with the sharp cries of practitioners, their bamboo shinai clashing in precise, ritualized strikes. Every movement is measured, every stance textbook perfect, a far cry from the desperate, mud-choked brawls that defined samurai combat. Today's martial arts emphasize form and discipline, but historical accounts paint a radically different picture. Warriors who fought not with elegance but with whatever kept them alive. A 12th century scroll from the Genpei War describes a samurai strangling an opponent with his own helmet cord after losing his sword, while another account praises a warrior for gouging out an enemy's eye with a broken arrowhead. These weren't dishonorable acts, they were standard battlefield pragmatism. Consider Iaido, the art of drawing and cutting in a single motion. Modern practitioners perform katas with graceful, deliberate sweeps, the blade never touching flesh. Compare this to the Hagakyo's chilling advice. When fighting in darkness, strike low. Men bleed more from the thighs, and their screams unsettle those behind them. Real samurai didn't duel in well-lit dojos. They ambushed each other in rain-soaked forests where the goal wasn't scoring points but leaving corpses. Even the iconic Iaido draw was less about ceremony and more about surprise. Assassins perfected slicing through a victim's ribs before the victim could even register the blade was out. The divergence goes deeper than technique. Contemporary kendo forbids strikes to the legs or throat, yet battlefield manuals like the Hojo Soun explicitly target these areas. A 15th century drill involved thrusting a spear into a suspended straw dummy's groin, training warriors to exploit the one spot even the best armor couldn't fully shield. Other banned moves in modern dojos, stomping on a downed opponent's neck, using the sword's hilt to crush a windpipe, were once standard practice. Archaeologists examining mass graves from the Sengoku period found skeletons with telltale fractures, cheekbones shattered by pommel strikes, femurs cleaved at angles suggesting deliberate crippling blows. Perhaps the most glaring contrast lies in weaponry. Kendo's shin-ai flexes to absorb impact, mimicking the ideal of controlled force. But excavated swords from the Kamakura era reveal a grimmer truth. Many were crudely reforged from farming tools, their edges deliberately notched to tear flesh rather than slice cleanly. A cache of weapons found near Tsukahara included daggers with grooved blades designed to funnel blood away from the hilt, preventing slippery grips during prolonged slaughter. These weren't the spiritual extensions of warrior souls later eras would romanticize. They were butchery tools optimized for efficiency over aesthetics. The sanitization wasn't accidental. When the Meiji government banned swords in 1876, martial arts had to rebrand or vanish. Kendo and Iaido became character-building exercises, their lethal roots buried under layers of ritual. The same swords once used to split skulls were now displayed in tea rooms as art objects. But fragments of the old ways persist in unlikely places like the kata, performed by some rural Iaido schools, where the final move isn't a clean cut, but a savage downward twist to ensure the blade doesn't get stuck in bone. A whisper of the past, proving that no matter how much we polish history, the bloodstains never fully fade. The death poem of the samurai poet Mizuta Masahide hangs in the air like unsheathed steel. My storehouse burned down, now nothing stands between me and the moon. At first glance, it reads like a Zen meditation on loss, but scholars tracing the brushstrokes noticed something unsettling. The characters for storehouse and lord share nearly identical radicals in classical calligraphy. Was this a farmer's lament or a dying warrior's indictment of the Tokugawa regime that had reduced his class to poverty? Such double meanings lurk beneath the surface of countless jisai. The farewell versus samurai composed moments before seppuku or battle. These weren't just elegant last words, they were cryptographic rebellions, smuggled past censors in the guise of tradition. Take the infamous verse by the disgraced daimyo Asano Naganori, written hours before his forced suicide in 1701. Falling cherry blossoms return to the branch, but only as spring rain. Most interpreters focus on the cyclical imagery, but the original manuscript shows deliberate smudging around the character for branch, a homophone for shogunate. Between the lines, Asano was accusing the Tokugawa system of executing men only to later exploit their martyrdom for propaganda. Even the cherry blossom metaphor cut deep. The same flowers the state used to symbolize noble sacrifice were in nature hardy survivors that bloomed brighter after pruning. The most daring codes emerged from the so-called Lotus Scroll conspiracy of the early Edo period. A network of Ronin poets circulated verses comparing Bushido's demands to natural phenomena with hidden meanings. One anonymous stanza described river stones worn smooth by currents that called themselves masters, a clear jab at how the Tokugawa reshaped samurai identity through relentless pressure. Another likened loyalty to winter ivy clinging to dead trees, its seasonal imagery masking a critique of feudal devotion to collapsing regimes. These poems traveled via a clandestine route, scribbled on the backs of temple donation slips where their Buddhist themes offered plausible deniability. Yet some Jisai wielded humor as their sharpest blade. The samurai Dr. Yamazaki Gentatsu penned this couplet before execution for treating rebels. The persimmon still green / learns sweetness comes only with time. On its face, it reflected on life's fleeting nature, but contemporaries would have caught the vulgar pun kaki meant both persimmon and lower anatomy, suggesting the shogunate's rulings were as half-baked as unripe fruit. Even the poem's structure mocked authority. Its uneven meter violated classical waka rules, a poetic middle finger to the regime's obsession with order. Why did the shogunate tolerate such subversion? Because the alternative, admitting these verses carried treason, would have exposed Bushido's fragility. When the Ronin Miyamoto Musashi supposedly wrote, "Crossing uncharted mountains / my sword's shadow cuts nothing," before his death, officials praised its humility. Only later did scholars notice the second meaning. A sword casts no shadow when it moves too fast to see. The very line celebrating restraint was secretly boasting of lethal skill the state could never control. The tradition persists today. In 2018, a descendant of the 47 Ronin recited an ancestor's Jisai at a Tokyo protest against political corruption. The crowd heard nostalgia. Those who knew the old codes heard defiance. For centuries, we've been taught these poems represent serene acceptance. But real samurai understood their final act wasn't just dying well, it was making sure their truth outlived the blade. The blade glints, the abdomen tenses, then the swift, agonizing motion we all imagine when we hear the word seppuku. But what if those iconic scenes of samurai ending their lives with a single, flawless cut were more theater than reality? Forensic anthropology is rewriting this chapter of Bushido, and the findings are as startling as they are undeniable. Autopsies on preserved samurai remains reveal a disturbing pattern. Abdominal wounds often too shallow to be fatal, entry angles suggesting the blade was guided by a second, and in some cases, clear signs the fatal strike came after the ritual cut. This wasn't failure, it was deliberate staging, a carefully choreographed dance between honor and survival. Take the case of the Fukushima clan retainers in 1703. Historical records praise their mass seppuku after a failed uprising, claiming 30 men died without a single cry. But when researchers examined skeletal remains excavated in 1998, they found only 5 had abdominal trauma consistent with self-disembowelment. The rest showed clean decapitations, no evidence of prior cuts. Even more telling, the vertebrae fractures indicated the blows came from behind, the work of an appointed kaishakunin assistant who likely struck before his comrades could falter. These weren't cowards, they were men playing their part in a ritual where the appearance of courage mattered more than the act itself. The why becomes clear when we follow the money. Clan finances recovered from Edo period archives show a stark reality. Families of warriors who died well kept their lands and stipends, while those branded dishonorable faced generational poverty. A daimyo's secret diary from 1689 spells it out. Ordered Heisugawa to perform seppuku for the tax deficit, but instructed the kaishakunin to strike at first movement. His sons will still inherit. This was economic calculus disguised as honor. A system where the theatrics of suicide preserved more than reputation, they preserved entire bloodlines from ruin. But the most damning evidence comes from the blades themselves. Metallurgical analysis of seppuku daggers in the Tokyo National Museum reveals a shocking detail. Many were dulled or even blunted before use. One wakizashi short sword registered barely 30% of the sharpness needed to cleanly pierce human tissue. These weren't weapons, they were props. Even the legendary tanto knives gifted as seppuku symbols often had their edges rounded, a practice confirmed by Smith Guild records that list orders for ceremonial-only blades. The ritual's evolution tells its own story. Early medieval accounts like the Azuma Kagami describes seppuku as a battlefield last resort, warriors gutting themselves to avoid capture, sometimes flinging entrails at enemies. By the Edo period, it had become an elaborate bureaucratic procedure. Police records from Osaka detail how officials provided assistance to condemned criminals, while physician journals note the rise of opium-laced sake to dull pain during the performance. The ultimate irony, as Bushido became more romanticized, the reality grew more staged. A shogunate memo from 1722 even standardized kaishakunin training, mandating they strike before the subject's face distorts with pain. Perhaps the most poignant revelation comes from personal effects. A farewell letter discovered in 2012, tucked inside a warrior's armor, contained instructions to his kaishakunin. Wait until I touch the blade to my belly, then make it swift. My son is watching. This father wasn't fearing death, he was engineering a memory, ensuring his child witnessed courage rather than agony. In the end, seppuku's greatest truth may be this: the ritual wasn't about dying at all. It was about controlling how life remembered you. When the Meiji government stripped samurai of their swords and status in 1876, the streets of Tokyo didn't empty of men with topknots and tattoos, they just slunk into the shadows. These were the Kyokaku, the so-called chivalrous outlaws, who became the bridge between fallen warriors and the Yakuza underworld. Historians tracing the lineage of organized crime have uncovered a chilling truth. The Yakuza didn't just mimic Bushido, they preserved its most brutal pragmatism long after the government sanitized it. A tattoo artist's ledger from 1889 tells the story in ink. Clients requesting designs of cherry blossoms alongside katakana spellings of old battle cries, their bodies becoming living archives of a banned culture. The connection runs deeper than symbolism. Dr. Haruka Sato of Waseda University spent a decade comparing Edo-period Bakuto gambler codes with surviving samurai clan laws. Her research reveals eerie parallels, like the Tekiya peddler gang's strict hierarchy mirroring the Hatamoto retainer system, or the Yakuza's Yubitsume finger-cutting ritual echoing feudal punishment for warriors who failed missions. These weren't crude imitations, Sato explains. Dispossessed samurai literally wrote the early Yakuza rulebooks. A 1923 police raid on an Osaka gambling den uncovered scrolls copied verbatim from the Hojo clan's 15th century mercenary contracts. The most damning evidence lies in the rituals. Modern Yakuza initiation ceremonies still feature Sakazuki sake exchanges nearly identical to samurai vassal pledges, right down to the 3 sips representing heaven, earth, and man. But where Bushido spoke of loyalty to lords, the underworld adapted it for a new godfather, the Oyabun. A confiscated Kaban underling diary from 1936 describes his boss invoking Tsunetomo's Hagakure before ordering a hit. Like the cherry blossom, be ready to fall, but make sure you take 10 enemies with you. The irony: Yamamoto Tsunetomo wrote those words about accepting inevitability, not manufacturing sacrifice. Archaeology adds another layer. Beneath a Yakuza safe house demolished in 2008, workers found a cache of Mekyugi sword pins stamped with the Mon crest of the Satsuma Rebellion's exiled samurai. These weren't heirlooms, they were counterfeits mass-produced during the 1920s as Yakuza factions appropriated rebel imagery. Even today, Ika gang headquarters often display keikomono scrolls with subtly altered Bushido maxims. One infamous example in Kobe replaces the classic: a warrior should always be prepared for death, with a blade kept sharp never doubts its cut. The relationship wasn't one way. Post-war police reports describe disgraced kamikaze pilots finding work as Yakuza enforcers, bringing Imperial Japan's twisted Bushido with them. A 1952 interrogation transcript quotes one such recruit sneering, "The emperor said die for nothing, my Oyabun pays me to live well." By the 1970s, Yakuza films like Battles Without Honor and Humanity openly mocked Bushido's corporate co-option. casting gangsters as the last true samurai, a narrative that still fuels Japan's criminal underworld. Yet the most poignant legacy might be linguistic. The Yakuza term jingi, humanity and justice, directly lifts the Confucian virtue jin that once governed samurai conduct. When a Kyoto gangster was arrested in 2019 for shielding civilians during an earthquake, his statement to police quoted a forgotten Ronin's diary. Benevolence isn't given by status, it's taken through action. The line between outlaw and heir has always been thinner than the paper those old codes were written on. The crack of matchlock fire echoes across a digital recreation of a 16th century battlefield, shattering the myth that samurai clung to swords out of some sacred tradition. CGI reconstructions based on surviving manuals reveal rows of armored warriors kneeling in precise formations, their Tengashima muskets unleashing volleys that would make a European arquebusier blush. This was Hojutsu, the forgotten art of samurai gunnery, and it flourished for over 300 years before being memory holed by Edo-era propagandists. A painstakingly animated sequence from the Topoki Chronicle shows Oda Nobunaga's troops decimating Taikta cavalry at Nagashino in 1575, not with elegant sword strokes but with 3 rotating lines of coordinated gunfire. The smoke clears to reveal a truth Bushido's later custodians tried to bury. Samurai didn't just tolerate firearms, they mastered them. Forensic ballistic studies compound the revelation. By analyzing lead residue on excavated armor, researchers confirmed some clans used specialized ammunition like the Tetsu Hoden iron pellets designed to punch through early bulletproof cuirasses. Digital recreations of these rounds in motion show them spinning with rifle-like precision, contradicting claims that samurai guns were inaccurate novelties. Even the much romanticized katana found its role redefined. Period illustrations digitized by Kyoto University depict swords being used primarily to signal troop movements once gunpowder dominated battlefields. The iconic blade became less a weapon than an officer's baton. Perhaps no reconstruction dismantles myths more brutally than the Harayama Ryu Hojutsu Densho, a gunnery manual whose animated adaptation shows warriors drilling with muskets alongside spears. Frame-by-frame analysis reveals a disarmingly modern approach, shooters exhaling before trigger pulls, squads using hand signals to coordinate reloads, even primitive sniper techniques where marksmen waited for victims to step into pre-measured kill zones. The most startling sequence demonstrates Moto Weri splitting wooden targets with bullets to prove shot placement, a direct parallel to sword testing rituals like Tameshijiri. Firearms weren't antithetical to Bushido, they were absorbed into its practice. Why then did Japan's gun culture vanish from popular memory? The answer flickers to life in a digital overlay comparing 17th century castle designs. Early fortifications like Azuchi featured sprawling gun decks and angled loopholes for enfilading fire. But as the Tokugawa shogunate consolidated power, later castles like Edo's prioritized ornate gates over defensive firepower. The message was clear. Guns symbolized the chaotic Sengoku era, while swords represented the orderly Edo peace. Animations of Smith Guild records show the suppression in real-time musket production quotas dwindling as swordsmiths received state subsidies. Yet the most haunting reconstruction comes from a cache of Nishiki-e woodblocks recently scanned in 4K. These secret pictures show daimyo hosting lavish gun demonstrations for Dutch traders while publicly decrying firearms as barbaric. One particularly damning sequence depicts a shogunate official practicing with a rifled breech loader in his garden, years after banning peasants from owning guns. The hypocrisy isn't subtle. The animation overlays his practice shots with census data showing firearm seizures spiking in peasant villages that same year. These digital resurrections do more than correct the record. They expose how fluidly Bushido was rewritten to suit those in power. Every CGI musket blast echoes with a question. What other inconvenient truths have been buried beneath the weight of cherry blossom myths? The answer may lie in the next reconstruction, already underway, of a shogun's vault rumored to hold the very guns his historians claimed samurai never embraced. The samurai code was never carved in stone, it was written in shifting sands. Each era reshaped Bushido to suit its needs, bending warriors' legacies like swords reforged for new battles. The Tokugawa shogun turned mercenaries into bureaucrats, the Meiji government spun their swords into propaganda, and Hollywood draped their ghosts in celluloid fantasy. But the truth survives in the cracks between these polished myths, in merchant ledgers detailing paid-off duels, in frayed armor straps repaired with peasant cloth, in the shaky handwriting of a dying Ronin who confessed, "I followed no way but survival." These contradictions aren't flaws in the historical record, they're proof of humanity. Real samurai weren't paragons of a singular ideal. They were fathers who smuggled rice to starving villages after confiscating it as taxes, swordsmen who practiced Zen meditation while teaching assassins to poison wells, Christians who kissed crucifixes before cutting down unarmed foes. The beauty of their legacy lies not in some pristine moral code, but in how they wrestled with the same dilemmas we face today: when to obey, when to rebel, and how to live with the blood on our hands. Primary sources reveal what hagiographies hide. A tax collector's journal from the Edo period shows more samurai deaths from gambling debts than battlefield wounds. A courtesan's memoir describes drunken warriors sobbing over unpaid loans before donning their armor for ceremonial processions. Even the revered Hagakure contains a passage where Yamamoto Tsunetomo admits, "I have never known true Bushido, only my lord's whim." These aren't betrayals of the warrior ideal, they're its heartbeat. So the next time you hear phrases like ancient wisdom or timeless honor, ask whose timeline we're following. The same ink that recorded seppuku rituals also documented warriors faking their deaths and fleeing to fishing villages. The swords displayed in museums as souls of samurai were often mass-produced for conscripted farmers during wartime. History is a palimpsest, and every generation writes over what came before, which brings us to today. Look around at the traditions we hold sacred: the corporate loyalty oaths, the patriotic slogans, the social media performances of virtue. 200 years from now, what will scholars uncover about our own myths? Will they find the deleted emails proving some ancient family recipe was invented for a TV show? The focus group notes behind a politician's heartfelt speech, the samurai's greatest lesson isn't about honor, it's about skepticism. Question the stories sold to you as immutable truth, because the most powerful lies are the ones we don't realize we're telling ourselves. So grab history by the scruff and shake it until the hidden receipts fall out. The past was never simple, and neither are we.